What would you do if the only home you could afford was a forgotten cemetery? If the only roof over your head came with acres of leaning headstones and the silent company of the dead? For Rose Aldis, a young schoolteacher in 1890 Oregon with nothing left to her name but a trunk of books and a well-worn coat, this wasn't a question of fancy. It was the only choice she had. She bought the derelict Hollow Creek Cemetery for a price so low it was laughable, a transaction that earned her the town's pity and scorn in equal measure. They saw a desperate woman clinging to a patch of weeds and sorrow. But the truth waiting inside that neglected land, buried deeper than any coffin, was a secret that had been sealed for 50 years. It was a story of greed, of a stolen legacy, and of a quiet justice that would rise from the very soil everyone else had abandoned. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, because this is the story of the woman who bought a graveyard, and in doing so, unearthed her own history. Rose Aldis arrived in Hollow Creek on the back of a mud-splattered wagon, the late autumn mist clinging to her dress like a second skin. She was 24, but the past year had carved lines of an older woman around her eyes. A false accusation from a wealthy parent at her school in Portland had cost her her position, her reputation, and the small room she rented. With her own parents long gone and no family to speak of, she was adrift. Her meager savings had dwindled to almost nothing, spent on the journey to this remote timber town she'd only known from a faded map. Hollow Creek was a place people left, not a place they came to. She had $112, a letter of introduction that was now useless, and a quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken entirely. She had spent her first night in the town's only boarding house, the thin walls offering little comfort against the cold or the stares of the other lodgers. The next morning, she'd walked to the county clerk's office, her boots sinking into the muddy track that served as a main street. She was looking for land, any small parcel she could afford, a place to put down a root, however shallow. The clerk, a man with a stained vest and a bored expression, had laughed when she told him her budget. He'd been about to send her away when a thought struck him. He pulled out a dusty plat book, running a grimy finger down a list of unwanted properties. "There is one thing," he'd said, a smirk playing on his lips. "The old Finch Cemetery, been fallow for decades, comes with the sexton's cottage. The Finches want it off their books. They'd probably pay you to take it." He'd named a price. $10. That was more of an insult than an offer. For Rose, it was a lifeline, a cottage, a roof. It didn't matter where it was. The transaction itself was a public humiliation. The clerk insisted she finalize it with the owner directly, Thaddeus Finch, the grandson of the town's founder, and a man who wore his inheritance like a crown. They met in the saloon, the only place Finch conducted business. He was loud and dismissive, surrounded by men who echoed his laughter. He looked Rose up and down, taking in her patched coat and earnest face. "The boneyard?" he boomed, so the whole room could hear. "You want to buy the boneyard?" He signed the deed with a flourish, taking her $10 as if it were a joke. "Enjoy the company," he'd sneered, sliding the coins into his pocket. Rose had simply folded the deed, her face a mask of quiet dignity, and walked out into the misty street. She did not look back. She now owned 2 acres of forgotten souls and a small stone cottage on the edge of town. It was a strange inheritance bought with the last of her dignity, but it was hers. That evening, as she stood before the rusted iron gates, the wind whispering through the tall, dark pines, she felt a profound and unsettling peace. She was home. What compels a person to choose a place of endings as a new beginning? Was it desperation, a simple lack of options, or was it a deeper, unspoken kinship with things that had been left behind? For Rose Aldis, standing at the gate of her new property, the line between the two was as blurred as the horizon in the Oregon mist. What secret was the overgrown land keeping? And why would a man sell his family's legacy for the price of a bottle of whiskey? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories like this. For Rose, the answers were buried just beneath her feet, waiting for a hand patient enough to uncover them. The town of Hollow Creek thought they knew the story of the old cemetery, but the real story was just beginning. The first trip into town for supplies was an ordeal of whispers. As Rose walked into the general store, the handful of customers fell silent, their eyes following her as she moved between barrels of flour and sacks of beans. The storekeeper served her with a brisk, almost fearful efficiency. She could feel their judgment, a mixture of pity and suspicion. A woman living alone was unusual enough. A woman living alone in a graveyard was an aberration, a creature of grim folklore stepping into the light of day. They saw her as touched by sorrow, or perhaps madness. The whispers were like insects buzzing just at the edge of her hearing. The old Finch plot. Not right for a woman alone. What does she do out there? Rose kept her gaze fixed, her posture straight. She had learned long ago that reacting to scorn only fed it. Silence was her shield. She paid for her supplies, her hands steady as she counted out the coins, and turned to leave. That's when she saw him. Thaddeus Finch was leaning against the counter, a smug grin on his face. He'd been waiting for her. He pushed himself upright, blocking her path. "Well, if it isn't our town's newest and quietest resident," he said, his voice carrying through the silent store. "Settling in with the neighbors, are we? I trust they're not too talkative." A few of his companions snickered. Rose simply met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Enjoying the view from the cottage?" he pressed, stepping closer. "My grandfather built that place. He had a strong stomach, but even he didn't sleep out there. Said the ground didn't rest easy." He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial growl. "You'll be run out by ghosts before the first frost, schoolmarm. That land has a memory, and it ain't a pleasant one." He expected her to flinch, to argue, to show fear. She did none of those things. She just waited. After a long, tense moment, he grew tired of the game and stepped aside with a dismissive wave of his hand. As Rose stepped out into the muddy street, clutching her cloth sack, a soft voice called her name. She turned to see an old woman sitting on a bench outside the store. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair two long braids of silver. She was Ilara, a local woman of the Clatsop people, whose family had been on this land long before Hollow Creek was a name on a map. She beckoned Rose closer. "Pay him no mind," the old woman said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "His words are shallow. The earth is deep." She looked at Rose with eyes that seemed to see more than just a tired young woman. "Some roots grow in the dark. They are the strongest. Don't be afraid of the soil that fed them." Rose, taken aback by the unexpected kindness and the strangeness of the words, could only murmur her thanks. She didn't understand what the woman meant, but the cryptic blessing felt like a small, warm stone in her pocket as she began the long walk back to her silent home. It was a warning and a promise, and it would echo in her mind for weeks to come. Her first full days at the cemetery were a lesson in solitude. The sexton's cottage was a single room, built of sturdy, square-cut stones, with a small hearth and a sleeping loft. It was cold, damp, and smelled of wood smoke and decades of disuse. But the roof was sound, and the windows, though filmed with grime, were unbroken. Rose spent hours scrubbing the floorboards, cleaning the soot from the hearth, and washing the panes of glass until the pale autumn light could finally spill inside. She unpacked her few belongings, a change of clothes, a cast-iron skillet, and her precious books. Virgil, Shakespeare, a Latin grammar. They looked strange and out of place on the rough-hewn shelf above the fireplace, relics of a life that no longer existed. At night, the silence was absolute. There were no sounds of wagons, no voices from next door, only the sigh of the wind in the towering Douglas firs that ringed the property and the occasional mournful call of an owl. The darkness was so complete it felt solid, a physical presence pressing against the small cottage. She began to explore the grounds, her home. It was 2 acres of chaos. Headstones tilted at drunken angles, swallowed by blackberry vines thick as a man's wrist. Fallen branches and layers of damp leaves obscured paths that had been gone for a generation. The iron fences around the family plots were rusted and broken. It was a place of profound neglect, a testament to a town that had turned its back on its own history. The task of restoring it seemed not just daunting, but impossible. She stood on the porch one evening, watching the mist roll in from the creek below, and felt a wave of despair wash over her. Finch's mocking words returned. Maybe he was right. Maybe this place was too sad, too heavy with forgetting, for one person to reclaim. She had not bought a home. She had bought a responsibility she could never fulfill. It was on the 3rd day that she had her first visitor. He wasn't human. A dog, black as shadow and thin enough to count his ribs, appeared at the tree line. He was a mix of breeds, with one ear that flopped and another that stood alert. He watched her with intelligent, wary eyes, refusing to come any closer. Rose left a small piece of her bread on the porch step. She didn't call to him or try to approach. She simply left the offering and went about her work. The next morning, the bread was gone. That evening, he was back, a little closer this time. She put out a scrap of bacon and a bowl of water. She began to speak to him, her voice soft, telling him about her day, about the stones she was trying to write. She decided to call him Shadow. He never barked or made a sound. He just watched, a silent witness to her lonely labor, his presence a small, flickering flame against the vast, encroaching darkness. He was as much a stray as she was, and in this forgotten place, they were beginning to form a silent pack of 2. The work became a ritual, a way to mark the passing of days that would otherwise have blurred into one long, gray expanse. Rose decided to start in the northwest corner, the oldest section of the cemetery, and impose a small patch of order on the wildness. She had an old scythe she'd found in the cottage's lean-to shed, and she spent the first week simply clearing the suffocating overgrowth. The rhythmic swing and slice of the blade was a kind of meditation, a physical answer to the turmoil in her mind. Her hands, once soft from holding books and chalk, grew calloused and strong. She pulled thorny vines until her arms were scratched and bleeding, and piled the debris into great heaps to be burned. Slowly, painstakingly, the stones began to emerge, like lost ships rising from a green sea. Most were simple, weathered markers of slate or sandstone, their inscriptions almost erased by a century of wind and rain. As she worked, Shadow grew bolder. He would now lie on the porch while she was inside the cottage and follow at a safe distance as she moved through the grounds. His presence was a quiet comfort. He was her only companion, and his silent loyalty was a balm to her solitude. One afternoon, while she was wrestling with a particularly thick tangle of ivy that had completely encased a small, child-sized marker, she felt a wet nose nudge her hand. She looked down, startled. Shadow was beside her, his tail giving a slow, tentative wag. From that day on, he was her constant shadow in truth, trotting at her heels, sitting patiently as she worked, a silent guardian in her kingdom of stone. It was in the 3rd week of her labor, near a gnarled and ancient oak tree that dominated the highest point of the property, that she found the anomaly. She was clearing the ground around the tree's massive roots when she uncovered a patch of earth that felt wrong. The rest of the hillside was rocky clay, stubborn and pale. This spot, a near-perfect rectangle, was filled with dark, rich loam. It was soil from the valley floor, fertile and black. It had no business being up here. At its head stood a single, stark headstone, a thick slab of gray slate completely blank. No name, no dates, not even a symbol. It was utterly anonymous. Furthermore, it was misaligned, set at a slight angle to the neat, if neglected, rows of the other graves. It was a discordant note in the funereal symphony of the place. It felt deliberate, like a secret being poorly kept. Rose ran her hand over the cold, smooth surface of the stone. It offered no clues. A pauper's grave, perhaps? But then why the expensive effort of hauling rich soil all the way up the hill? The question lodged itself in her mind, a small, insistent burr. For now she had other stones to tend to, other plots to clear. But her eyes kept drifting back to the blank slate under the old oak, a silent question mark in a field of periods. The days shortened, and a persistent, chilling rain set in, turning the cemetery grounds into a slick tapestry of mud and fallen leaves. Rose's work slowed, but it did not stop. The mystery of the unmarked grave pulled at her, a puzzle she couldn't leave alone. She spent her mornings working, her afternoons reading by the fire, and her evenings thinking. She had created a map of the cemetery on a large piece of butcher paper, carefully marking each grave she uncovered, noting the family names and dates. The Finches, the town's founding family, had the largest plot, enclosed by a grand, if rusted, iron fence. The blank stone sat well outside it, isolated and apart. It didn't belong to any family group. It was an island. Her labor took on a new character. It was no longer just about cleaning. It was about listening. She felt a growing sense of stewardship, a connection to the forgotten people buried beneath her feet. She reset the toppled stone of a Civil War veteran, his epitaph speaking of honor and sacrifice. She carefully cleaned the lichen from the marker of a woman named Sarah Miller, who had died in childbirth at only 19. These were not just names, they were stories, and she was their last living librarian. Shadow seemed to sense the shift in her. He would often sit directly on the patch of dark loam by the blank stone, as if guarding it, his gaze fixed on her as she worked nearby. His quiet insistence only deepened her own. One afternoon, she noticed something else. The grass on that particular plot, nourished by the rich soil, was a brighter, healthier green than anywhere else on the hill. It was a small, living clue. Finally, she could ignore it no longer. She told herself it was a practical matter. If the ground was settling unevenly, the blank headstone might fall and break. She took a long iron rod from the tool shed, one used for probing the earth for rocks, and returned to the spot. Shadow whined softly, pressing against her leg. "It's all right, boy," she murmured, though her own heart was beating faster than usual. She wasn't intending to disturb a grave, only to understand the soil, to feel what was beneath. She pushed the rod into the earth, a foot from the stone. It sank easily through the soft loam. She tried again, a few inches over. The rod stopped with a dull, jarring thud. It wasn't the sharp crack of hitting rock. It was a flat, metallic sound. A sound that echoed with hollowness. She probed the area systematically, mapping the object's dimensions. It was rectangular, approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. And it was shallow. Far too shallow to be a proper coffin. A chill, entirely separate from the damp autumn air, traced its way down her spine. Whatever was buried here wasn't resting in peace. It was waiting. Respect for the dead was woven into Rose's very being, but so was a teacher's insatiable need for answers. She wrestled with her conscience for a full day before deciding this was not a grave, it was a secret. With a shovel and a deep breath, she began to dig. The work was slow and careful. She removed the dark loam layer by layer, setting it aside on a canvas sheet, as if she intended to put it all back exactly as she found it. Shadow paced nervously, letting out low whines. his animal senses alive with the strangeness of her task. An hour into the work, the flat top of an iron box came into view. It was black and pitted with rust, but solid. It was not a coffin, but a casket, a strong box built to withstand time and secrets. As she cleared the last of the dirt from its lid, she saw a crest forged into the metal, a stylized finch, its beak clutching a small, intricate key. Her breath caught in her throat. This belonged to the founder, Jedediah Finch. It took all her strength, wedging the sharp end of a crowbar into the seam of the lid, to break the seal. The groaning shriek of tortured metal echoed across the silent hillside. For a moment she froze, half expecting the sound to bring the whole town running. But there was only the drip of water from the pine boughs and the sound of her own ragged breathing. With a final desperate heave, the lid gave way. She lifted it, her muscles trembling with effort and anticipation. Inside, there was no body. The interior was lined with oilcloth, still supple and waterproof after all these years. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. She lifted it out. Its pages were filled with neat columns of names, dates, and figures. Beneath it was a bundle of deeds, tied with a faded silk ribbon. And at the very bottom, resting on the oilcloth, was a single, heavy document of folded vellum, its flap held closed by a formidable wax seal bearing the same crest as the lid. It was, she knew with a certainty that made her hands tremble, a last will and testament. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, she carried her impossible findings back to the cottage. She lit the lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows, and sat at her small wooden table. She opened the ledger first. It was a meticulous, secret accounting of every burial plot sold in the cemetery for 50 years. Beside each payment was a second entry, under a column headed Town Tithe. A tithe that, according to a note in the margins, was never paid. Then she unrolled the deeds. They were the original land grants for the town of Hollow Creek, including the cemetery itself. A clause, circled in faded ink, stated the land was to be consecrated and turned over to the township upon the establishment of a church. It never had been. The land she stood on was still, legally, private Finch property. Finally, with a deep breath, she broke the wax seal on the will. The script was dense, elegant, and written entirely in formal, legal Latin. For anyone else in Hollow Creek, it would have been indecipherable. But for Rose Aldous, the disgraced schoolteacher with a passion for the classics, it was as clear as day. And as she began to translate, the carefully constructed history of Hollow Creek and of the Finch family began to unravel completely. The document began not with the usual bequests, but with a father's fury. It spoke of a son, Thaddeus I, whose greed and cruelty had broken his father's heart. For these sins, the will declared him disinherited, and it named a new heir to the entire Finch fortune, the timber rights, the bank shares, the very land the town was built on. It was all left to Jedediah's beloved and wrongly hidden daughter, Elspeth. That night, the sky broke open. A fierce Pacific storm, which had been lurking off the coast, slammed into the mountains. Wind howled through the pines, a sound like a grieving giant, and rain came down in sheets, drumming against the cottage roof and turning the cemetery paths into rushing streams. The storm felt elemental, as if the land itself were raging against the revelation of its secrets. Rose sat by the fire, the documents spread on the table before her, the lantern light flickering wildly. Every gust of wind threatened to extinguish the flame, to plunge her back into the roaring darkness. Just after midnight, a sound like a cannon shot cracked through the storm. A massive pine branch, heavy as a battering ram, crashed to the earth, shattering the stone of a nearby grave and landing mere feet from her cottage wall. The ground shook. Shadow barked, a sound torn away by the wind. In the midst of this tempest, a new sound emerged. Hoofbeats, frantic and heavy, and a man's angry shouting. A figure on horseback loomed out of the rain-swept darkness. It was Thaddeus Finch, his face slick with rain, his eyes wild with drink and fury. He threw himself from the saddle and hammered on her door. "I know you're in there, you grave-robbing witch!" he roared over the wind. "Someone saw you digging. This is private property, my property." He rattled the latch, threatening to break the door down. Rose's blood ran cold. She was alone, miles from any help, with a man who had every reason to silence her. But as she looked at the will on her table, a new and unfamiliar strength flooded through her. It was the righteous anger of the disinherited, a fury she was now the custodian of. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and unlatched the door. She held the lantern high, its light illuminating her pale, determined face. Shadow stood beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "This isn't your land, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice shaking but clear and loud enough to cut through the gale. It never was. He stared at her, momentarily stunned by her defiance, then let out a string of curses and threats, promising to return with the sheriff at first light to have her thrown in jail. He remounted his horse and galloped away, swallowed by the storm. Later that night, another knock came, this one timid. It was a family, their wagon disabled by a fallen tree. It was the Millers, whose family plot she had so recently tended. Their children were soaked and shivering. Without a second thought, Rose brought them inside, sharing her small store of food, her blankets, and the warmth of her fire. As she comforted the sleeping Miller children, she knew she had made her choice. This place was not just about the dead. It was about the living. She would not be frightened away. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving a world washed clean and broken. Rose left the Miller family sleeping in the warmth of the cottage and, without stopping for food or rest, rode the 10 miles to the next county seat, a larger town with a courthouse and a reputation for sober-minded men of the law. She clutched the oilcloth bundle of documents to her chest the entire way. She sought out the office of a lawyer named Silas Croft, an older man known throughout the region for his sharp mind and unwavering honesty. He listened to her story patiently, his expression betraying nothing as she laid out the tale of the unmarked grave and the iron casket. Then, she laid the documents on his desk. He spent over an hour examining them, reading the ledger, checking the seals on the deeds, and most importantly, translating the Latin will himself. As he read, his eyebrows climbed higher and higher. When he finally looked up, his calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of profound astonishment. "Miss Aldous," he said, his voice hushed with awe, This is impeccable. The will is ironclad. The evidence of fraud is undeniable. The history of your town is a lie." They rode back to Hollow Creek together. A crowd had already gathered at the small town hall, drawn by the news of Thaddeus Finch's furious accusations. Finch was there, smug and confident, with the local sheriff by his side, ready to arrest Rose on sight. He began to shout the moment he saw her, calling her a thief and a trespasser. Mr. Croft held up a hand, and the sheer authority in the gesture silenced the room. Calmly, methodically, he laid out the truth. He presented the founder's will, reading his own English translation aloud for all to hear. He explained the land fraud, the unconsecrated ground, the decades of stolen fees detailed in the ledger. A wave of murmurs and gasps rippled through the crowd. The Millers, standing in the back, spoke up, telling everyone how Rose had sheltered them during the storm. The townspeople looked from the pale, quiet schoolteacher to the sputtering, red-faced Thaddeus Finch. The chorus of whispers that had once mocked Rose now turned on him. Finch's bluster evaporated, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out man. He was not arrested. The statute of limitations on the fraud had long passed. But he was ruined. In the eyes of his neighbors, his name was now synonymous with theft. He stumbled from the hall, a man stripped of his legacy. Later that day, back in the quiet of the cottage, Rose looked at the will one last time. The name of the disinherited daughter, Elspeth, seemed to shimmer on the page. On an impulse, she retrieved the old family Bible from her trunk, the only heirloom she possessed. She opened the brittle cover. There, on the flyleaf in her grandmother's elegant script, was her family's lineage, and at the top of the page, a name she had never truly considered, Elspeth Aldous, born Elspeth Finch. Ilara's words came back to her. Some roots grow in the dark. Her family's long, unexplained history of poverty and misfortune was not a curse. It was a crime. She, Rose Aldous, the last of her line, was the rightful heir to Hollow Creek. The seasons turned. The last of the autumn rains gave way to the quiet hush of winter snow, and then to the vibrant, determined green of an Oregon spring. The Hollow Creek Cemetery was transformed. The leaning stones were righted, the rusted fences mended, the paths cleared and lined with stones from the creek bed. It was no longer a place of forgetting. Townspeople, their shame over their long neglect, now replaced with a renewed sense of connection, began to visit again. They tended to the graves of their ancestors, leaving wildflowers and small, polished stones. They greeted Rose not with whispers, but with quiet nods of respect. The Millers helped her plant a vegetable garden beside the cottage, its neat rows a testament to new life. The iron casket, its secret finally told, now sat by her front door, filled with soil and overflowing with blue forget-me-nots. One evening, at that perfect golden hour when the sun slants low through the tall pines, Silas Croft paid her a final visit. The last of the legal matters were settled. The Finch timber holdings, the shares in the bank, the deeds to most of the town's commercial buildings, they were all hers. He looked at her, this quiet woman who now owned a town, and asked the question everyone was wondering. "What will you do with it all, Miss Aldous?" Rose didn't look at the papers in his hand. Her gaze was fixed on the cemetery, on the rows of peaceful stones catching the last light of day. Shadow rested at her feet, his head on his paws, content. She had her home, her companion, her garden. She had a place in the world. She thought of the work her hands had done, the satisfaction of bringing order from chaos, of honoring the forgotten. She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I didn't come here to own a town," she said softly. "I came here to tend a garden. It just turned out to be bigger than I thought." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet justice. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in what we acquire, but in what we choose to care for when the rest of the world has looked away. If you were moved by Rose's journey, please consider leaving a like and a comment to let us know. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and earned redemption. We'll have another story